Okay, this is a quick revision of Liar by Duffy. I'll assume that you've read the poem, that you've studied the poem and know something about it. So this is just going over some central points. First of all, it's really interesting to look at the title, Liar, in contrast to the first phrase of the poem. She made things up. Liar, very negative connotations. She made things up, much more positive. This seems pretty euphemistic. Now when you look at the contrast between the two, liar and she made things up, it immediately creates that sense of there's a difference in attitude between the two things. Liar, negative, she made things up, much more positive. And that contrast lies at the heart of the poem. It's the idea that people can have different attitudes towards this same thing, this lie. For example, that she was really a man. After she'd taken off her cotton floral day frock, very old-fashioned. And the word frock itself is archaic. It's a really old-fashioned word. We don't tend to use it much nowadays. She was him all right. In her head, dressed in that heavy herringbone from Oxfam. Again, old-fashioned. When she turns into a man, adopts a suit that's an old-fashioned suit. It's second-hand already. It's from Oxfam. And that herringbone, quite an old-fashioned traditional costume. So while she puts on the clothes of a man, she remains the same in herself. She is still old-fashioned. Look at the caesura here. She was him all right. In her head, that pause separates herself. The caesura separates parts of the sentence. It could represent a separation of the self, a separation of the persona. He was called Susan, actually. Look at the difference between the pronoun he, which is a gendered pronoun, and the name Susan, again a gendered name, a gendered proper noun. There's a contrast, again. He, male, Susan, female. We get that tension, that contrast. The eyes in the mirror knew that, but she could stare them out. The eyes in the mirror knew that is about appearance. She looks in the mirror, she can see what she appears to be like. But that appearance, while it's undeceived, can be challenged by her mind. She could stare them out. To stare someone out connotes intimidation. It's the idea of mind over matter. She can look at herself in the mirror and go, okay, I'm a woman. But if she forces herself to really concentrate, she can convince herself that she's a man. It's the power of the mind. Second stanza. Lots of repetition. Of course a job. Of course a hung jump city flat. Of course the usual friends. There's a sense through the repetition and that being quite mundane, quite monotonous, that her life is quite ordinary. It's quite repetitive, quite mundane. Her life is like our life. There may be peculiarities, that she may be unique in some way, but we all are. These two words, lover, sometimes, holophrastic, a single word sentence. And we'd need to consider why that's the case. It's used a few times by Duffy. It's certainly suggestive of speech. And we certainly get the idea running through this that there's a conversation taking place about the persona. She lived like you do. If we feel at all alienated from the persona, if we think that she's different to us, Duffy's at pains to try and point out that there are similarities. She lived like you do. And then we get into this important extended metaphor, which is a really hard one. A dozen slack rope ends in each dream hand, tugging uselessly on memory or hope, frayed. So it's an extended metaphor of a rope. Ropes normally connote something strong that binds one thing to another. But here, this rope doesn't work. It's not held tightly at either end, it's slack. Also, it's frayed at the ends. It's broken, essentially. Now, this is a tricky one. But essentially, what we've got is her desperately clinging on to hopes and to memory. This rope seems to be her mind. And her mind is struggling to hold on strongly to the past and to the future. As all of our minds are. You know, memory is something that doesn't stay. It disappears slowly. And our hopes change all the time as well. Again, we might be seen to be quite like this woman. Freud's particularly important with this again. Again, it's holophrastic. And we've got caesura before and after it. So again, just as the sentence here is broken, so is the rope. She told stories. Another example of euphemism, going back to that first line of the poem. All this euphemism, again, goes back to that first line where we've got the sense of you could judge things in different ways. You know, you could look at something as positive, you could look at something as negative. We use euphemism to make something seem more polite, something more acceptable. Then we've got the italics that used to represent direct speech. I lived in Moscow once. I nearly drowned. We actually hear the persona talking to us. We hear her lying to us. And there's nothing too terrible about this. And yet we get the comment from the speaker, rotten. Rotten, I would argue, collocates liar. Rotten liar. A judgment is being placed on these utterances. First stanza. Again, the direct speech continues. Lightning struck me, and I'm here to tell. You can probably hear the collocation, the tale. Here to tell the tale. But ellipsis is used to omit that section. We're filling in the gaps. We know what should come there. And it's interesting that the tale is a euphemism for a lie. We hear the strong voice of judgment again, though, afterwards. Liar. Followed by lots of synonyms for lies. Hyperbole, falsehood, fiction, fib. And it's, again, interesting to see that these all have very different connotations. Fib has got pretty positive connotations. It's a lie that's only a gentle lie. And so what Duffy is perhaps reminding us is that there are judgments attached to these things. It's not like lies are bad, full stop. We can judge them in different ways. Into another metaphor. Were pebbles tossed at the evening's flat pool? Well, if you toss a pebble into a pool, you're going to get ripples. There will be an effect. But they're only tiny. A tiny effect. It doesn't really disturb the nature of the pond or the pool. And pebbles are very small. So we're talking about doing something that's not going to have much of an effect, particularly if it's the evening's flat pool, potentially something like the sky, where there would be no effect. I think one of the things we also need to be aware of with this is, because there are so many metaphors, why use them? Why use so much figurative language? And when you think about it, metaphors are lies. You're saying something is something that it's not. So just through the choice of that technique, Duffy is reminding us of the very nature of the poem. Her bright eyes fixed on the ripples. It's worth referring back to that first stanza where the eyes were referred to again. If you remember, those eyes were being used to convince the mind. The mind was overpowering what we're seeing. The mind was overpowering appearance. Here, her bright eyes were fixed on the ripples. She's focusing on the effect of her lies. She wants to see an effect. She wants people to be interested in what she's got to say. But no one believed her. Another metaphor. Our secret films are private affairs watched behind the eyes. Again, we've got that extended metaphor here, and it's universalised by the word our. It's not just her things that she's imagining, that she's picturing behind her eyes, these kind of visions, these hopes, these dreams. We're all having these kinds of dreams. We might not be cross-dressing, but certainly we've got some little fantasies that go on in our own heads. She's spoken subtitles, not on. A kind of synesthesia. Subtitles are things that you see, whereas speech is something that's said. So mixing those two creates a sense of confusion. And there's confusion here, both in the mind of the protagonist and also in those people who listen to them. Finally, the stanza begins from bad to worse. Again, there's a sense of ellipsis. Something's been missed out. And if you think about the collocations there, you've got she's gone from bad to worse, or it's gone from bad to worse. But that bit's missed out, and we're forced to judge it and then put that section in. The ambulance whinged all the way to the park where she played with the stolen child. Well, the ambulance is being personified through the whinging. And that could connote going on and on, something that Susan does. It also connotes a child. Whinging is something that's normally associated with a child's behaviour, and that's appropriate as well, because it kind of foreshadows what's happening here, why the ambulance is arriving. You know the rest. Suggests this is an old story, that this is something that happens broadly. You know, we've heard of someone taking a child and, you know, using that relationship with the child to kind of reinforce the person's self-belief. The story isn't about an individual, it's about people in society generally. Then as we reach the conclusion, Duffy hammers home her point. The man in the long white wig, who found her sadly confused. The man in the long white wig is the judge. He's dressed up. He's dressed up in a wig, and yet he's judging the person who dresses up. Duffy seems to be suggesting that who are we to judge who's right or wrong in society, what's normal, when we institutionalised this kind of wig wearing, this kind of cross-dressing. The top psychiatrist who studied her in jail, this is an archaic way of spelling jail, so again, old-fashioned. It goes back to the first stanza when we looked at her in her frock. It seems again as if someone is having archaic language applied to them, so it's more universal. It's not just her that's old-fashioned, this person's old-fashioned as well, and yet this is the person that's dealing with her. And the final person that's dealing with her then went back home and did what he does every night to the Princess of Wales. He's not really doing this thing to her every night. It's another delusion, and yet this is the person who's been institutionalised by society to deal with the person with the delusions. Duffy seems to be suggesting that we all have these kinds of delusions. Who is anyone to judge?